The cold breeze of a national cemetery pressed down on everyone, the sky dark and filled with sadness. The mood was somber, reflecting the pain of those present. Soldiers in full uniform stood stiffly, their medals catching the faint light, their faces blank. A widow, tearful and trembling, held a folded flag tightly in her hands, the last piece of her lost love. At the forefront of the ceremony, General Oliver Briggs stood tall, wearing a spotless uniform. His face was hidden behind dark sunglasses, his skin a deep, rich brown, and his gloves stark white. Though he had faced battle and lost many times, today was different. Major Alex Murphy, who was being laid to rest, had been much more than a soldier. He had been like a brother, someone Briggs had watched grow from a raw recruit to a respected officer. Now his life had been stolen by an explosion in a distant war zone. The ceremony was nearing its end. The final gun salute had rung out, and the soft notes of the bugle's last call faded in the distance. The crowd stood quietly, waiting for the last rites. Briggs took a deep breath, preparing himself for the final moment. And then, a voice broke through the stillness. "Get on the ground. Hands where I can see them." The shock was instant. Heads turned to see the source of the commotion. A pair of police officers standing at the edge of the gathering, their guns drawn. One of them was young, his eyes wide with uncertainty, the hand resting near his holster shaking. The other, Sergeant Roy Matthews, was an older man, bulky and rough-looking, his scowl deepening the wrinkles on his face. Briggs didn't flinch. The crowd held its breath. Some soldiers, instinctively reaching for their weapons, were reminded that they were unarmed for the event. The widow gasped, her heart breaking anew. Briggs's voice was calm and commanding, the kind that had led men in life-threatening situations. "What's the meaning of this?" he asked, his tone even but filled with authority. Matthews took a step closer, his hand hovering over his firearm. "I said, hands up!" The silence was thick with tension. No one moved. The only sound was the wind rustling the trees, the shuffle of uneasy footsteps on the damp ground. General Briggs stood firm. His face remained unreadable, as steady as the veterans around him, who were staring in disbelief. Matthews was not just disrespecting a man, but a military hero, a man who had saved lives, led with honor, and had earned respect across the nation. Briggs's voice, steady as always, sliced through the air. "You're making a mistake." Matthews sneered, his fingers tightening on the gun. "A mistake? What kind of mistake?" Briggs tilted his head slightly, his voice quiet but dangerous, like a man who had seen the worst of life and knew how to handle it. Matthews wasn't listening. His mind was fixated on his own bias, and he was about to discover the consequence of underestimating the wrong person. The crowd gasped again, stunned by the unfolding scene. The soldiers around Briggs exchanged uncomfortable glances, their hands clenching at their sides. This wasn't some civilian. This was General Oliver Briggs, a leader who had fought for his country time and again. And yet, Matthews treated him as though he were a criminal. A heavy silence took hold, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Briggs didn't flinch. His chest rose and fell with slow, controlled breaths. He was a man who had faced far more dangerous moments, but this moment, the disrespect in Matthews's eyes, struck a different kind of chord. Matthews barked again, his voice louder, filled with arrogance. "I said, hands up now!" His words were laced with an ugly mixture of authority and prejudice. His finger tightened dangerously on the trigger. The younger officer, Officer Ellis, hesitated. He looked torn, his eyes darting nervously between his partner and the growing crowd. He wasn't as quick to draw his weapon. "Sergeant, I don't think this is right," Ellis stammered, his voice unsure. Matthews shot him a sharp look, silencing him. He was determined to follow his misguided instincts, convinced that Briggs was somehow a threat. Briggs took a slow breath, his mind processing the absurdity of the situation. He had fought in numerous wars, survived ambushes, and faced the horrors of battle. Yet here, on American soil, at a fellow soldier's funeral, he was being treated like an enemy. Not for his actions, but because of the color of his skin. The soldiers standing by were not mere spectators. They were men and women who had fought beside Briggs, who had trusted him with their lives. And now, they watched in disbelief as Matthews disregarded everything they knew about their leader. But Matthews wasn't concerned with respect or honor. He was blinded by his own prejudice. Briggs's voice cut through the air once more, low but dangerous. "I'll give you one last chance," he said. His words were calm, but carried the weight of authority. "Lower your weapon." Matthews scoffed, his grip tightening. "I don't take orders from you." Briggs's lips barely moved, but his words were clear. "No, Sergeant, you don't." A chill ran through the crowd. Even Ellis, standing beside Matthews, could see that his superior officer had lost control of the situation. The tension in the air was palpable. Matthews's face reddened, his breath quickening. Ellis glanced at the soldiers, their expressions hardening. One wrong move, one impulsive action, could turn this from a standoff into a tragedy. But Briggs remained as still as a stone. Finally, Briggs spoke again. "What exactly do you think I did?" His voice was measured, but there was a clear challenge in it. Matthews sneered, a flicker of hatred in his eyes. "I don't take orders from people like you." The tension in the air was thick as ever, the murmurs of disbelief and shock swirling among the crowd. General Oliver Briggs stood steadfast, his eyes unwavering, staring directly at Sergeant Roy Matthews, whose grip on his weapon was beginning to falter. Matthews's voice was low, but his words still dripped with prejudice. "This is a military funeral. You shouldn't be here." The accusation was clear, veiled with an unspoken judgment. Briggs blinked, his gaze sharp and piercing. "People like me?" he asked, his tone calm, but the challenge was undeniable. Matthews didn't waver. He stood taller, his broad frame bracing against the weight of his weapon. "You don't belong here. You were acting suspicious, standing too close to the casket." Whispering something, Briggs almost laughed aloud. A prayer he had offered, a prayer for the fallen soldier, for the life of someone who had fought for this country. But Matthews, seeing a black man standing solemnly at the front, assumed something sinister. His ignorance was all too clear. The other officers, their faces stunned with disbelief, exchanged looks, unsure how to react. But Matthews wasn't done. "I won't ask again," he barked. "Get down on the ground now." That was the moment it all shifted. General Briggs's eyes, sharp and unblinking, scanned the scene before him. The tension had been building, but now it was different. Suddenly, it felt like he was the one in control. His voice, low but commanding, cut through the air. "Sergeant Matthews," Briggs said, his voice smooth and steady. "Do you have any idea who you've just drawn your weapon on?" Matthews scoffed, clearly not understanding the gravity of his mistake. "It doesn't matter," he muttered. "The law is the law." Briggs's lips curled into a cold, dangerous smirk. Wrong answer. For the first time since Matthews had drawn his weapon, his confidence wavered. It wasn't visible at first, but something shifted. Briggs's calm, unshaken presence, his sheer certainty, began to have its effect. Matthews faltered, just for a second. The whispers began to spread like wildfire. The crowd, those who had stood by Briggs for years, murmured under their breath. "You don't know who that is," a young officer whispered, his voice barely audible. "If he doesn't back down, he's making the biggest mistake of his life." Another officer, realizing the weight of the situation, whispered back urgently, "He doesn't understand who he's up against." Officer Ellis, still standing beside Matthews, looked pale. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched in anxiety. He glanced nervously at the soldiers behind Briggs, his eyes widening as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just any soldier. They were all part of a much larger, much more respected group. And General Briggs? He wasn't just anyone. Colonel Margaret Stone, a commanding figure in the honor guard, stepped forward, her sharp voice cutting through the tension. "Sergeant Matthews," she said, "do you realize who you're pointing your weapon at?" Matthews's face twisted in disbelief. He scoffed, but Stone remained unfazed, pointing at the 4 silver stars on Briggs's shoulders. Matthews went pale, the realization sinking in. His hand shook, the gun trembling in his grasp. Briggs stood still, letting the silence stretch, his gaze unwavering. Matthews stepped back, his confidence shattered. "Tell me, Sergeant," Briggs asked coldly, "when you saw me standing there, paying my respects, what did you think I was doing?" Matthews couldn't answer. Briggs's voice grew sharper. "You saw my skin, and you decided I was a threat." Matthews clenched his jaw, unable to speak. Briggs's voice dropped, filled with contempt. "You profiled me. You humiliated me. You drew your weapon at a funeral, in front of my comrades, and never once questioned it." The cemetery was deathly quiet. Matthews's hands shook as the weight of his actions crashed down on him. He had acted out of fear and bias, and now there was no way to undo it. The air remained thick with the weight of the moment, as Matthews stood frozen, his weapon now useless in his trembling hands. Around them, the soldiers, the officers, the mourners, all bore silent witness to a moment that would never be forgotten. General Briggs, unwavering in his presence, had not only proven his strength of character, but exposed the raw truth about the biases that had driven Matthews to this point. As the tension began to dissipate, Matthews slowly lowered his weapon, his face flushed with shame. The reality of what he had almost done hung heavy in the air. In that instant, he had been forced to confront his own prejudices, the consequences of which could have been catastrophic. Briggs, however, remained composed, his respect for the fallen soldier and for the soldiers standing with him clear in every measured breath he took. The lesson was unmistakable. In a world filled with assumptions, the truth is a weapon stronger than any gun.